Hey guys. All right. Today we're back with more Eastery. It's been a couple months since I last watched Eastery. Last time we watched France's brilliant plans to win World War II, I believe. Now we will be watching Germany's plans to win World War I. Imperial Germany. Whew. Pretty much. I find this one to be rather easy to state. Germany's plans to win World War I was to pretty much repeat their success in the War of 1870, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, in which they literally just marched into Paris. They kicked French ass. Now, this was a different French military. However, the French military of the early 1900s still kind of had that reputation of 1870. However, trench warfare, of course, would change war, and also the British were not involved in the War of 1870. They weren't there on the French shores fighting the Germans. It was pretty much the Germans versus the French, and the Germans kicked the French ass, or well, the Prussians kicked French ass. I can't speak words. I'm gonna shut up, and we're gonna start with watching the video.
Imperial Germany, country famous for military fashion and war plans. In fact, in this video we are going to see what were the German plans to win World War I and how they changed. In early 20th century, the alliance of Germany...
Just gotta add, excellent addition of the point of they changed. War plans change. The German strategists of the early 1900s were smart. It's just that the forces that they had to go up against, they had a lot more people than them, and they had a lot more access to way more resources than the German economy did at this time. So, yeah.
And Austria was opposed by the alliance of Russia and France. The strength of the alliances was quite equal, so an inconclusive and bloody war was to be expected. The German army wanted none of it and looked at its potential enemies for weaknesses. It was believed that one of the weaknesses of the Entente nations was that due to its size and poor infrastructure, it would take Russia several weeks more than Germany to get its entire army to the front. Until that time, Germany had to contend only with France and had an upper hand. The Germans wanted to use the first weeks of the war to inflict a blow from which their enemies would not be able to recover. The question was where to do it. They could attempt to destroy the Russian forces stationed on the border, but due to the long distances of the Eastern Front, the damage would have been limited. The distances in the west were much shorter, and it was possible to inflict more damage to the French army. For this, the Germans had to draw the French into a decisive battle. The best way to make the French to fully commit their troops was to invade France, but the French had prepared just for this occasion and had built a line of fortifications on the Franco-German border. So the Germans decided to bypass the line by moving through Belgium, then defeat the French army in a decisive battle, forcing France to make peace. Then they would move the bulk of their forces east and use the newly gained superiority to defeat Russia. The pieces were all set, and all that was needed was someone to light the fuse. On the 28th of June...
Yes, Eastery, yes. So, these people that... I'd say they pretty much wanted war. All these Western powers, they pretty much wanted war. Austria-Hungary was hungry to gobble up more of the Balkans. They wanted the Balkans under their complete control. Germany wanted to take more land from France. The French and the Germans hated each other. They also kind of wanted war with Russia to gain more of former Polish land. As well, just because the western portion of Russia is the fertile land, so getting access to that also would have been lots of food for the German people. The Germans, however, it's arguable Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted war with Britain. He had been building up a navy since the late 1800s. They kind of stopped by 1910-ish because it was, one, getting expensive, and Germany could not keep up with the British. But they were having a naval race for battleships. So yeah, the Ottoman Empire also would have liked probably to regain more land in the Balkans themselves as well as uh, land in the Middle East, most likely. Um, so the war was inevitable. It was just kind of who would spark it off, how it would spark off, and the other undecisive factor was Britain. Britain did not want to commit to a war. They profited most out of the without there being a war, there was then no one to really challenge their authority on the world scale. Um, because this is where the economy was centered at the time during the world. It was Europe still. Europe was still the focus of of world economy. Um, America was rising at this point as well, but still Europe was the main focus and would be for a long time. Couple more decades or so. But Britain profited most from there being peace and there being uncertainty among who was the continental superpower, right? Uh, they had control of the navy. They had control of the seas. That's how they made money. So, yeah.
In 1914, Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated and declarations of war followed. Now, Germany was able to implement this plan and moved into Belgium. They managed to advance into France, but their plan as a whole proved to be too optimistic and they failed to trap and destroy the French army, and fighting resulted in a stalemate. Also, Britain joined the Entente and enacted a maritime blockade on Germany. Trench warfare set in on the Western Front, making attacking difficult. It meant that it would be more complicated for Germany to defeat France, but at the same time made it unlikely that Britain and France could invade Germany. Meanwhile, in the east, the absence of the German army had made itself felt. They managed to keep control over East Prussia, but Russian army had made inroads into Austria-Hungary, threatening to knock it out of the war and tied up many Central Powers units. In 1915, the Germans decided to go over on defensive in the west and stabilize the situation.
Because Austria-Hungary's forces were absolutely useless. They are losing a war to Serbia. The tiny country of Serbia is kicking Austro-Hungarian ass.
In the east to free up the...
Obviously, the reason the Austro-Hungarian Empire, their military was not effective is because, well, they are a very multi-ethnic and multicultural, multi-linguistic country. Like, a lot of the languages here do not come from the same group. Austria, of course, deriving from Germanic, and then you've got the Slavic peoples. So, there's the languages do not mold well, and that's causing, the officers, of course, speaking a different language than the troops under their command. So there's a lot of issues there.
Troops. The Russian army had prepared for a short war, and its weak weapons industry could not yet adequately supply its troops. They were unable to resist the Central Powers and took a defensive stance by shortening the length of the front twofold. In this time, Bulgaria was convinced to join the Central Powers, which allowed them to defeat Serbia. This was, however, offset by the entry of Italy into the war. The Eastern Front was now secured, although Russia still remained in the war. In the early 1916, the situation of the Central Powers had been stabilized, but the British blockade was slowly sapping their strength, and in order not to lose the war, they had to inflict a decisive defeat on the Entente. In the east, it would be difficult for them to reach the areas vital for Russian war effort due to vast distances and poor infrastructure. Even if the Germans would be able to make substantial advances, it was hard to make Russia surrender. Operations in the east would be more difficult than in the previous year, as the Russian army had shortened its defensive lines and was beginning to overcome the supply shortages. Although the Central Powers could have been successful in Russia, they would probably find themselves committing a lot of their troops without removing Russia from the war. In the west, there was trench warfare, and German attacks needed to expend a lot of men and material resources to break through the Entente defenses. In case of German advance, the French and the British could pull back, inflicting vast casualties and winning slowly by attrition. or they could counterattack, thus making the losses more equal but denying the Germans any territory. Neither of the options could lead to a decisive German victory. Instead, the plan was to make the Entente attack the Germans and expend their manpower on strong defenses. After they had sustained enough losses, the Germans would have the superiority needed to go on an offensive and win the war. It was not an easy task to make the Entente adopt such a suicidal strategy, so a complicated and cunning plan was devised. The Germans would attack the fortress of Verdun, where they could create a great tactical advantage for themselves, but which was symbolically vital for the French. The plan relied on three assumptions. After the initial German successes, the French will not withdraw from Verdun, but will at any cost attempt counterattacks to regain the land around it. The British and the French shall launch an attack on the German defenses in other sectors to ease the German pressure on Verdun. During these operations, the French and the British would suffer much more casualties than the Germans. The first two assumptions were correct. The French held on.
Big brain plays. Level 9000 IQ. Galaxy brain right there. Galaxy brain.
To Verdun, and the Entente attacked at Somme to help with the defense. But the third assumption was not. During these operations, the Entente had suffered the loss of 1 million men, but the German casualties were only slightly smaller. The Germans had made another miscalculation. They had assumed that in 1916 the Eastern Front would be quiet. But the entry of Italy to the war in the previous year had divided the Austro-Hungarian forces, and the measures to improve the armament of the Russian army began to kick in. The Russians carried out a successful offensive, pushing the Austro-Hungarian forces back. Soon the situation deteriorated even further, as the success of Russian attacks convinced Romania to join the war against the Central Powers, and now German reserves had to be dispatched to save the Eastern Front from collapse. The Central Powers had failed to inflict a decisive defeat on their enemies and were mostly on the defensive again, with the British blockade bringing their defeat nearer by the day. It was time to think outside the box and adopt creative and risky strategies, or war was lost. The risks associated with these strategies were huge. Germany now attempted to knock Russia and Britain out of the war. A revolution had taken place in Russia, but the new government decided to carry on with the war. German plan was to support the influence of the left-wing political parties in Russia, hoping that they would create internal strife, causing Russia to make peace. They allowed Lenin to travel back to Russia from Switzerland and allegedly gave large subsidies to his Bolshevik party. This strategy was risky, as the success of socialists in Russia could very well cause instability or even revolution in Germany itself. The other plan was to starve Britain into surrendering by using the German submarine fleet to sink the British shipping. For this strategy to be effective, the Germans had to sink all the ships carrying cargoes to Britain, which included the ships from neutral countries. This carried the risk of war with these nations. Unrestricted submarine warfare had been adopted earlier, but later discontinued in the fear that America would declare war on Germany. Now the situation was deemed to be desperate enough to risk it, and unrestricted submarine warfare was reintroduced. At the same time, Germany attempted to free up troops by reducing the length of the Western Front and substituting men with weapons. Despite these efforts, during 1917 they couldn't spare troops for more than maintaining the current state, which would ultimately result in defeat. Entente offensives in the West were
So one of the issues that Germany certainly had in World War One, and another issue that would be seen in World War Two. However, I don't think. No, towards the end of the war, yeah. Manpower issues. Germany does not have that much manpower. They cannot sustain a war for too long with heavy casualties, as was being seen in World War One. The British, on the other hand, have a lot of colonies to sustain the need of manpower. The French also have issues with manpower. The French in World War One, following the end of World War One, they would not really recover even up until World War II. They were still recovering from the loss of men at the onset of World War II in 1939. They suffered a lot. The British, on the other hand, were able to kind of nudge it off because, well, they had India. They had a huge place to pull troops from.
repelled and sizable forces were dispatched to Romania in order to seize its resources. Italian army was pushed back in order to keep Austria-Hungary in the war. It was all on the out-of-the-box measures by this time. The strategy directed against Britain failed totally, as the adoption of convoy system reduced the efficiency of the German submarines, and the United States did enter the war against Germany. Russia, however, was another
I
case.
love that little
Russian
picture.
army was weakened by the revolution, which allowed the Central Powers to advance and improve their positions. The Bolsheviks managed to increase their influence in Russia and deposed the government. They had to demobilize most of the army, but refused to make peace with Germany and attempted to incite revolution. The Germans managed to keep the situation under control. In order to resolve the situation in the east, the Germans went on an offensive. The Russian army had lost its fighting capabilities, and the German advance took over large parts of the former Russian Empire, forcing the Bolsheviks to agree to their terms. By this time, the resource stocks had become critical, and it seemed that unless the situation improved, defeat was only a question of time. Despite that, a window of opportunity had been created. The freed up troops from the east gave the Germans the numbers needed to have a chance to launch an offensive in the west. By now, both the Entente and the Germans had developed better ways to break through the enemy's trenches, and it was possible to undertake a decisive offensive. However, there was a catch. The Germans needed to defeat the Entente before the newly arriving American troops would make the odds overwhelming. They launched an all-out offensive. The attacks took large amounts of territory, but caused many casualties to the Germans. In the end, the line held, and the Germans were unable to deliver a decisive blow. It became clear that Germany was unable to win, and the Entente armies launched a counter-offensive. The Germans attempted to hold on to captured lands in order to secure a better peace settlement, but their army was spent and began to fall back towards the German border. As all was lost, Germany finally agreed to surrender. So, was Germany doomed from the start? Can you think of strategies which could have ended the war in a...
I would not say they were doomed from the start. I think it was their decision. So, Britain most likely would not have joined the war. As long as Germany did not invade Belgium. Belgium was the key point here, which brought the British into the war. If it had just remained Germany v. France, or well, it really depends. I think Britain would have joined in late, like the United States, depending on which side started losing. Because, well, Britain benefits best from two competing continental powers. They benefit most from Germany and France being competition. They do not benefit when either France or Germany are the sole continental European superpower, right? So it's in their best interest to keep them balanced. So yeah, don't know where I'm going off with that tangent, but that's about it on my argument side. There's a great video by Eastory. I love his channel. He makes excellent content, does some great research here. I love the detail on the maps as well. That's always really, really sick. You can tell economic epicenters here with the little dots. And then obviously Berlin, Prague, Warsaw, Paris, Amsterdam. No detail on Denmark. But yeah, that's going to be it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember, leave a suggestion down below for what you want to see me react to next. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.